right. I'll start now. So like just to recap the announcement last week, we have a small adjustment to the syllabus that we're going to have a guest lecture where we have invited speaker from University of Cambridge and Oxford on advanced geometric deep learning for 3D atomic systems on October 30th, which is a Wednesday. So I would highly encourage, if you could join in person, please join in person as much as possible, and I will be sharing a Zoom link. If you want to join from Zoom, that's also fine, because the guest lecture is going to be on Zoom. But it will be great if you can be in this room so we can like interact, and I can also like ask questions for the guest speakers. So I think this is very important for the rest of the lectures. So even if you can't join that lecture on Wednesday, do try to watch the lecture. I think the recording will be uploaded. And at the same time, the reading assignment 3 is out today, which is also very important. I think our guest speakers are the first author of the paper that I've uploaded for reading assignment 3. It's a very good paper to read if you're interested in geometric deep learning. And so definitely read this reading assignment, even though we're not giving you an open review question for this assignment, but it might be related to the problem set. All right, so there will be no open review invite for this reading assignment again, and there's going to be a guest lecture on October 30th. All right, so let's get started. Cool. So today we're gonna move on to a brand new module, which is the second half of our semester, where we move from just modeling the sequence to also consider structure and like more in beyond 1D space. But before that, we have a little bit left over from last class on the reinforcement learning. Where basically we want to frame the protein engineering and optimization problem as a reinforcement learning problem, where the goal is to train a best policy, where the policy can be a generated model to optimize the expected reward. A very popular algorithm for reinforcement learning is reinforced or policy gradient. Effectively, what it does is try to directly maximize the expected reward, where we could turn this objective effectively into an expectation of the joint trajectory with certain policy of the log likelihood of that probability trajectory, and times weighted by a reward function. And it can be seen that this function has a lot of similarity with the maximum likelihood training or supervised training. So one way of thinking about this problem is you could start with just data-driven pre-training, like language model, where you could start with just let the train a self-supervised learning model to like output the next token, which is your policy learned from the data. And in the RL setting, this can be also thought of as like imitation learning, where instead of giving you a reward, you could directly imitate the behavior, a given trajectory. So you can basically train a supervised learner first to start with, and then use reinforcement learning with reward to fine-tune your policy to optimize for the actual reward. So this kind of approach kind of setting is adapted to like language model training, where some people call it reinforcement learning with human feedback or reinforcement learning fine-tuning. Another thing about the policy gradient is, although it's the only RL algorithm that directly optimizes the expected reward, it has the notoriously bad behavior of having very high variance, where the variance in machine learning is called like, I talk about variance bias trade-off in the very first lecture, where because we're only observing partial data, and during the sampling of data and this Monte Carlo estimation, we will have different draws of data will result in a different fitting of the model, and because this objective overfitting has a very high variance, so perhaps because of this, you need to estimate the thing with Monte Carlo, with drawing empirical samples, it can subject to a high variance problem.
So one simple treatment for this is to subtract the reward with the baseline, where the baseline is estimated by the current reward you observed in the current batch. So theoretically, we can show that by adding this bias, by adding this baseline term, it does not change the objective at all. So so then we call like unbiased estimator, such that if the current algorithm converge, it will converge to the same optimizer as if you don't use the baseline. But magically, it also reduces the variance of this estimator. So in practice, we kind of introduce this baseline term a lot. Under certain circumstances, people can also call this baseline like a value function. And then the difference between the two, they call it like advantage function, where basically you can consider it as how much are you doing better than the average like reward you can get right now. And the other thing about policy gradient is we call it on policy. So we touched upon the concept of off-policy training last time a little bit, where because the training of RL algorithms sometimes involve this expectation over trajectories. So effectively, the expectation here can be taken with respect to like any probability, any distribution, right? So you just need to deploy a sampling strategy to get samples. However, the training objective for policy gradient is usually on policy, which if you want to truly converge, it is the best if the distribution you use to sample the trajectory is the same as the log of p that you're optimizing, which means it can be very expensive because each time you optimize it, you need to use the new policy to roll out samples, which could be a little bit limiting. And for off-policy learning, you can imagine that if you can use some other policy, which are easy to deploy, and you can also, even without any training, you can use another policy to collect samples simultaneously without needing to wait for the current policy to be optimized. So it would be great if we could do some sort of off-policy training for policy gradient. And indeed, there is certain way of doing it. So the trick here is to use importance sampling, which I think appeared in one of our early lectures as well, where because we cannot, when we talk about we cannot sample from any distribution, one simple way is to sample with sample with some distribution you know how to sample from, and then when you collect the sample, you can just say, yeah, this sample is very likely that it is coming from the distribution I truly care, so I use it, and this is not, right? So basically, you're kind of taking the ratio between the distribution you actually sample from and the distribution you want to sample from, and use that to upweight or reject or accept the samples, such that effectively you get the right sample from the distribution you really want. This is called importance sampling technique. So effectively, this policy gradient algorithm now becomes you can sample the trajectory from any arbitrary policy. Usually we call it behavior policy. Is the policy you deploy to interact and collect trajectories. And during this, inside this objective, we take the ratio between our true policy we're optimizing with divided by the behavior policy to correct for this off-policy effect. And we can prove that this quantity here is exactly the same, unbiased estimation of the expectation taken with respect to p theta, as if you were sampling with p theta. So this is kind of the very important trick that's used in RL a lot, in a lot of places where you could have even a slightly divergence between your current policy and behavior policy. So if you plug it into the things here, it will essentially becomes the ratio between trajectory, then becomes the ratio, effectively becomes the ratio between policy, because again, the state transition matrix is out of the picture because it's not optimizable. All right, so policy gradient and reinforcement learning has been actually also used for protein and molecule optimization a lot, especially, this example is where you try to generate like a molecule like SMILE sequence, or you could also think about more complex way of generating graph directly, where the actions can be like adding a node and adding an edge in the graph. So any kind of action that you can imagine that you could model can be treated as like a policy, and we can do the same trick, policy gradient, to train such policy of generating things that we want. And in this example, it's for small molecule small string generation. And the objective here is some quantity computed, for example, QED and SAS. And the other thing is you could use that to do docking for proteins. This is more recent work that I try to use AlphaFold, but we know AlphaFold is not super good. AlphaFold 2, not super good at multimer assembly. So what they do is basically they introduce some additional policy to kind of dock the multimers. Multimer means multiple proteins, multiple monomer proteins. And then you can use some measurement of how well the things are docked as a reward to train your policy to dock the two proteins. There are, of course, a lot more examples than these two. And one important example you can search for is called, discrete Bayesian optimization for small molecule small molecule and proteins. Because last time when we talked about variational autoencoder and Bayesian optimization, if you recall, we actually have to embed the small molecule into a continuous space where Bayesian optimization can be conducted effectively using gradient-based optimization. However, if we truly want to operate in the discrete space, then it's not directly, we talked about discrete optimization again, like 2 lectures ago. We can use similar thing for Bayesian optimization, but there's other way of framing that problem as a reinforcement learning problem. So you can think about sampling from this discrete space as your policy, right? And the reward there is the acquisition function in Bayesian optimization. So effectively, you're doing Bayesian optimization in the discrete space with a similar like surrogate model acquisition function, but you operate directly on the discrete space with very similar algorithm like policy gradient. So if you're interested, you could definitely look around, just search RL for molecule engineer, protein engineer, small molecule optimization. There are a lot of interesting paper along that line. But what's more interesting recently is the fine-tuning regime, where instead of directly goes for the RL training, which to be honest, is quite expensive and very data inefficient. So you think this might be the least you want to use in the Bayesian optimization setting where you have a very small amount of data. So I feel like the place that this kind of methods shine the most is as if you have a pre-trained model. Or basically you do some kind of imitation learning to begin with, where the imitation learning is done through this supervised pre-training with self-supervised learning model, like we talked about previously in protein language models, right? So this concept of reinforcement learning with human feedback is exactly similar like that. So the first step is you just do pre-training of your model, which is called PyRef. So y and x here is you can interpret that as x being the previous steps that you decoded and y being the next token, or x can be prompt and conditions, and y being the sample that you draw with the language model. So effectively, what this RL step is, fine-tuning step, is different from just doing RL. Is there a question? No? Okay. So you can see that this is the objective for the most common objective for reinforcement learning fine-tuning. You can see that the biggest difference between this and the policy gradient is this additional term of KL divergence regularization. So the mindset of RHF is that instead of just greedily optimizing for the reward, which could be human preference or some property that we care about, we're also aware that because we only have a limited amount of reward, our reward model can be super noisy. Again, it can be subject to uncertainty and a lot of weird behavior in terms of extrapolation. So we want to use our pre-trained model as a strong regularizer or as a strong prior to constrain how much we can optimize to collect better reward. So this is also called KL kind of entropy. You can also think of doing better exploration here. Instead of just greedily optimize for reward, we can also want to explore the space by just doing unconditional by just doing normal sampling with my pre-trained model. So these two perspectives are kind of important in RLHF, and it come up. So people come up with this KL regularized reinforcement learning objective, policy gradient objective, basically. Luckily, this formula here has a closed form solution where we can prove if we truly want to solve this problem, the target policy pi theta or the optimal policy should be in this form, which is effectively a weighted version of our current reference model, and where the weight is some kind of energy-based model defined over these reward. This looks very similar to you because previously we talked about like Boltzmann model, right? Essentially you do this exponential of reward divided by some temperature, which basically is kind of a distribution that is proportional to reward or exponent of reward, but you can also adjust like how greedily you want to follow this distribution by using like different temperature to kind of smooth out your energy function. And the beta here is the same as the parameter you add in front of the KL. So you can imagine that with a stronger beta, right, your distribution will leaning more towards the pi ref because the energy-based model now becomes more like a uniform distribution. So you're adding like stronger regularizer to this optimization function. An interesting mindset is an interesting technique that came out is called direct difference preference optimization, or DPO. So what's different there is instead of directly solving this KL regularized problem, they use this analytical solution of the true target policy pi, and what they do is they kind of rewrite the reward with the policy that you're optimizing. And the second step is because in this particular preference learning regime, we kind of need to build a model for reward given that we are only observing pairwise ranking result, where the ranking result is for a pair of samples y1 and y2, a human or some scorer will give it a ranking where we can say y1 is larger than y2 or the opposite. So this is kind of a not explicitly a scalar reward function, and how we connect this to a scalar reward is through this Blady-Terry model, where we kind of model the probability of y1 larger than y2 as kind of a binomial distribution, where this distribution, the parameter of this distribution is proportional to the reward that we're fitting. So it's kind of like a sampling without replacement, right? Where the probability of drawing the example that is ranked higher is higher. So the probability is proportional to the reward that we're fitting here. So it's effectively what DPO does is they, instead of doing the RLHF with the reinforcement learning objective, they do it with this likelihood objective, where y1, y2 can be collected by a policy. And the R star here, instead of estimating the R star directly from the data, they use this trick to exchange the reward with the policy. So instead of optimizing likelihood with respect to the reward, you can directly optimizing that likelihood with respect to the policy. So that became the loss for the DPO, where effectively they're still training this function of maximizing the likelihood, but instead of using the reward, they substitute in this parameter of pi theta by just rewriting this function here. Similarly, if you have a k-wise ranking instead of pairwise ranking, there's also a similar model called Pluckett-Luce model, where essentially model it as like drawing multiple samples without replacement. And if you plug in the similar substitution, you get the DPO loss for a list of k type of feedback. So yeah, you can imagine all of this is basically try to train a new policy, which is converging to the policy that is weighted. It's the weighted version of your current policy, where the weight is somehow related to the reward. So this kind of technique has been used in optimizing the generative model for proteins a lot recently, especially interestingly, the second module will talk about diffusion model for proteins, right? And interestingly, this can be adapted to diffusion model and flow matching model as well. So a very standard step right now for training protein generative model is do some sort of RLHF where the reward can be something that's truly important for design. This is one of the simple model where they try to use a DPO to fine-tune a sequence design model, which is very popular, called protein MPNN. We're going to talk about this model in two lectures. I think next week. Effectively what this does is we call inverse folding problem, where given a backbone structure, we try to guess what sequence fit into that structure. So it's effectively it's a protein sequence generated model conditioned on the structure. And what this paper does is, because we know that the generated sequence has some properties as well, and one such property is immunogenicity, where a certain part of your protein will be broken down into small peptides, like we talked about previously, and some of these peptides will be recognized by your immune system through binding to this molecule called MHC on top of your cell. And only a subset of peptide will be recognized by MHC, and therefore we can predict for a given sequence how likely that there will be some like subpart of the sequence that will be triggering this recognition pattern in your immune system. Right, and that will give you kind of a estimated likelihood of this design being immunogenic or not. So you can use this as a reward to score your different sequence. And then what this paper does is they try to use this score of immunogenicity to re-rank the sequence design model, such that by doing this fine-tuning, you will get protein sequence design that still fulfill the given scaffold or structure, but at the same time has lower probability to be immunogenic, which is kind of important if you're designing a drug. You don't want the drug to trigger too much immune response inside the human body. All right, so now that we finished the kind of module on protein sequences, we want to kind of motivate the next two big module in our class by starting from a simpler way of representing structure, which is the graph. So what a graph is usually, you can define a graph with two entities. The first is what we call node, where like each of the vertices in this graph is basically a set of entities. We noted by n, or sometimes v. And then the other necessary entity for a graph is called edges, which is pairwise relationship. Basically, between every pair of node, you can decide whether what relationship they have. And the simplest relationship is just whether there is a link or not, where the link is, you can consider it kind of as a binary notion of is there relationship between these two nodes. So each of the node can be associated with some features, right? Like in the protein, the features can be the amino acid type of the residue, right, and or the charges of the residue, for example. So the way we, so you can see that if we only consider node feature X, right, it's kind of like normal machine learning. But what's more important here is the definition of this pairwise relationships or the edges, which is what makes graph pretty unique. And usually what this part is represented by what we call adjacency matrix. It looks a little bit similar to the contact map that we talked about previously, right? Like for pair of residues, we say if there's a contact or not. It's kind of similar. But besides that, in the graph, adjacency matrix may not necessarily reflect proximity in space. So the contact map is specifically designed for space proximity, where in the graph, we can consider as much more general concept, right? Where the existence of an edge can be something beyond proximity in space. It can be whether like these two users are related, right? Whether they have some maybe relationship, or whether the two authors, they have like collaborated, or like one of them cite the other one's paper. So that this relationship can be represented more broadly. And so just in a formal setting, in the graph learning, we will assume the data that we're dealing with is called a graph, where the graph is represented by a vertex set, which is the node set, and adjacency matrix, which capture the edge, basically the edge information. And sometimes we will be given also a node feature, which can be represented as a d-dimensional features for each one of the node. And there are some notations, like V usually stands for a single node in your vertex set, and the N of V stands for the neighborhood of the V, where the neighbor is defined as any node that has one hop relationship or directly connected to the current node. Some examples of node feature, as I mentioned, right, can be very, very diverse, like basically anything that you can assign to a node representation. And for example, in the genomic use cases, you could also represent node as a cell, right, and or a gene, right, and the expression of that gene can be a node feature. So is it clear so far? Cool. And as I mentioned, the graph is actually more ubiquitous than like molecule graph. Although most of the lecture that I'm giving is focusing more on molecule graph, but graph is a more powerful representation of the real world relationship, and it can be found in all different scale in the world, in our world, from most micro scale like molecule graphs to interactions like protein-protein interactions or like gene pathways, right? To social network where kind of in the individual level there are relationship between different person, and in a much higher level, like the whole world is interconnected. So we can basically use graph to represent most of the data possibly in the world. And it is also interesting that you can the fact that you can do it at different scale makes the problem more interesting, such that you could actually connect data at different modality and different scale by trying to utilize graph. And in the biology, right, there are several graphs that are like commonly appearing. Some of them including like gene regulatory networks and pathways, where the relationship here is kind of like how likely that these two entities has certain type of interaction. And there's also knowledge graphs where you could have a rich realm of biological entities or medical entities, and they can be related, organized in the knowledge graph. And more relevant to our class is the 2D graphs, where we usually use that to represent small molecules, and where kind of the existence of an edge stands for like whether there is kind of a bond, a chemical bond between the two atoms in the small molecules. Which is slightly different from the 3D structures, because you can see that in the 2D structure, like each of this node reside in just a 2D space. So we don't actually capture like how close they are in the 3D space. And in 3D space, things can also rotate. So they're not necessarily in this flat 2D space. Versus in the 3D space, we actually characterize more precisely how things are located in the actual like physical 3D space. So before graph neural networks, actually, interesting, graph neural network came out just kind of in the middle of my PhD. So I kind of witnessed the change, the switch from like non-graph data to graph learning with deep learning. So before deep learning, and like the most popular modalities are images, computer visions, and text, which is NLP. Although they kind of unified right now with the attention mechanism, but before that, we can see that these type of deep learning are designed for very specific type of data. Particularly for image, we can call the data be as a 2D grid, or I think sometimes there's also like the notion of lattices. I know in physics or solid physics. Basically, it stands for very periodical and it stands for this kind of periodical and limited sized representation, where for the grid, you could, for each node in the grid, you can precisely know that there are 4 adjacency grid. They're connected in like the 4 directions. And you can lay down this grid in 2D space with this super periodical structure, which is very easy to deal with using, for example, convolutional neural networks, because every unit is kind of repeated, repeated with a sliding window. This is what we call the grid data. And the other type of modality is like 1D data, like text, which is, again, also very simple, and even simpler than the grid data, where because you're dealing with like sequential information, you again have like repeatable unit if you just go along the sequence. So this deep learning toolbox is designed for a very specific type of data modality, which is not if you just use whatever that exists, it does not work for graph, because there are two particular challenges. The first is the size. The graph has very arbitrary size and topological structures, where you could have pairwise. If you define pairwise information here, and you have n nodes, you have n to the square possibility of connecting them. And the node also have no fixed order, which we call it equivariance, which are effectively not very easy to capture by this kind of architecture, and we'll talk about it in a minute. So before that, just some definition on a graph. Well, there are like different types of graphs. Most popular ones like directed graph, undirected graph. The difference is like whether in the adjacency matrix do you specify the direction or not. So undirected graph will have a fully symmetric adjacency matrix versus a directed graph will not. In our case, I think we mostly consider directed graph, but there are undirected graph, but there are certain interaction in biophysics or chemistry. It's just not symmetric, right? Because if you consider interaction between the two atoms, right? If you consider from one atom and the other atom, they have very different environment, microenvironment. So usually you could also try to differentiate like the 2 points in the interface by setting it as a directed graph. And there's also the definition of heterogeneous graphs, which is less, it could happen in our case as well, if we consider multiple types of molecule systems, right? Within a single molecule or intermolecule representation, we can consider the interaction being a different type. So the heterogeneous graph essentially define a type for the node and edge here. So instead of having only a single node type and single edge type, you could try to differentiate some like types of the edge and nodes with additional features and modeling techniques. And the degrees here means how many neighbors that are connected to a single node. And if it's undirected, it's just counting the number of neighbors. If it's directed, there's also the differentiation of in degree, which is number of edges coming into the node, and out degree, which is number of edges coming outside of the node. And one notion is called self loop, which kind of, if you have this kind of loop that pointing to itself, we could call this like there's a self loop in the graph. All right, so for deep learning with graphs, the fundamental mindset in deep learning for all modality is representation learning, as we talked about in very early of the lecture, right? We want to convert the raw input to some kind of embedding space or representation space, such that the representation space can be used for different downstream tasks. And the mindset is very similar here for graphs, except that here the embeddings is assigned to each different node in the graph. So the goal of the most common setting in graph neural networks is to effectively learn with a deep architecture, we learn some embeddings for each of the node. And from the node embeddings, we can extend that to like further downstream applications, such as node level, edge level, and even graph level predictions. So as I mentioned, even though we're extracting embeddings with the mindset of like node level embedding, there's still a lot that this embedding can capture. Precisely, there's 3 most popular tasks considered in graph learning. There's node level prediction, where you can think of that as like classifying or regression at the node level, just to predict the features or some properties about each single node. And in our case, that could be like a atom amino acid type, right, for this residue in the protein. And there's edge level prediction, where usually just like predicting whether there exists a relation between the pair of node. In our case, it can be prediction of like chemical bound, or whether there is a bound between the two node. And the other thing is a graph level prediction, where you kind of care about the entire graph structure. In our case, it can be predicting the property of a molecule, an entire molecule or protein. So, again, like the key idea.
Quick question about the tasks.
Yep.
So, for example, say you're trying to do like target identification or something, which is you want to figure out which protein will interact with like some other protein you're designing.
Yes.
So, would like if I were to frame like the task in a graph
Mhm.
ML way,
Mhm.
could you possibly say that here's a new protein or like a new node that I want to add in the graph?
Yes.
Is the prediction task then figuring out which edges?
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
that would
Yeah.
be like graph level prediction.
Exactly. That will be the interaction. Will exactly be an edge level prediction task. Yeah. Great. So yeah, it seems you're understanding it very fast. So yeah, again, the key idea is to derive this node embedding, and then the entire kind of graph learning, graph deep learning architecture design is focusing on like how we can effectively train this encoder of nodes over the flexible graph type space. So while if we think about this, like this data, right, what's involved here is a set of feature vectors and a adjacency matrix. So a very naive solution is just concatenate them together and blindly apply, treat them as a matrix feature and feed that into some neural network, like multi-layer perceptrons, right? So apparently this doesn't work. Most apparent reason here is because the parameter of a lot of these like convolutional neural networks and MLP is fixed, so it doesn't deal with the flexible size. And more importantly, it does not have the equivariance property that we want, right? So then the kind of the graph learning, what the graph learning community tried to come up is like basically borrowing the idea of some convolutional neural networks, which kind of aggregate some local information and try to apply that convolution through different part of the grid, where in the convolutional neural network it's very easy because you can determine the order of how you slide this window. And in the graph learning, the key challenge we're solving here is how we slide this, how we choose how we slide this window, and secondly, how we can make the choice of this sliding window invariant or equivariant to the ordering of the node. So why is this challenging, right? The most challenging part about the graph is it is order permutation invariant, and also in some sense, there's also like the concept of permutation equivariance that comes next. But to understand these two key properties of graphs, the first one is the graph does not have a canonical order of the nodes. Canonical order means like one single unique order that will separate different graphs, right? So what that means is considering these two graphs, where if you just assign a different order, right, or basically when you represent a graph, right, you have to represent it in the matrix and with a feature, right? To store the things into computer, effectively you intrinsically decide the order of these nodes, right? Because the matrix has index. So how we're going to represent this graph? The order plan that we order these nodes effectively result in a different matrix or features. So in this example, right, if you say this node is A, then in the feature vector, like the feature of this node will be appearing in the first position of the feature matrix. Similarly, in the adjacency matrix, right, all the relationship related to A will appearing in the first row and first column in the adjacency matrix. Versus if you define a different order plan, you have a shuffling or permutation along this dimension, such that the feature and the adjacency matrix will be changed. And the change happens by doing this permutation of positions in that order dimension. However, you can see that for these two graphs, no matter how you change the thing, it's rather there's a way of representing the same graph with a different matrix in the computer, right? So effectively, these two are exactly the same graph, even though you have a different representation. So this is the difficulty that comes to, this is the difficulty what will cause the graph learning being difficult, because in image you don't have this problem. For each image you have a fixed ordering, you have a fixed adjacency matrix and fixed feature, versus for graph there's this one-to multi-mapping problem, where effectively you can have data that in either like one of the planning on the right-hand side, but you still want to derive the same result. So this is what we call permutation invariant. We want the result, if we're predicting a single value about this graph, it should be exactly the same for the two sets of representations. So define it more generally, we can say like two graph, right? If this is particularly in the case we're trying to predict a function that maps a graph to a scalar value or a single vector, where we call the operation or function f is permutation invariance, meaning that if you predict function for two sets of order plan, they have the same value. And then more generally, you can say that this function is permutation invariant if you, for any possible order plan of the same graph, the function remains the same. So the permutation here can be easily written as a matrix multiplication, right? The permutation matrix, if you do this PAP transpose, effectively does the permutation for you on the matrix. And the definition here is for any P, possible permutation matrix P, the result of this function with respect to, and this function will remain same for any possible P. Okay. Similarly, we have the notion of permutation equivariance. So this usually appears when we try to predict multiple values for a graph. So multiple value here means we're predicting edge level information, node level information. So if you have a graph with n nodes as input, and you're making a node embedding prediction, right? So you will have output of n embeddings as well. So this is a multi-to-multi mapping problem. In this case, we will define a property called equivariance, where basically it means that the permutation operation you apply to your input graph will be the same type of permutation will be applied to the output of the function. So basically, for example, again taking this two-order plan as an example, right? They're same graph, but their node order changed, and now. If we use these two sets of data as input, you will have a different feature where the feature of A will be located in the first position in the feature matrix, but in the second matrix, it will be located in the east position, which is the fifth position, right? So then when we compute the output, where if we care, we ask, what is the embedding of this A? Then in the output, the embedding of A should also appear in the first position, in the left-hand side. And similarly, on the right-hand side, the embedding of E of this node should be appearing in the fifth position. Is this concept clear? Any particular challenges understanding this equivariance?
Essentially saying that the representation of nodes is only defined by the relationship to other nodes, and if that is the same, you should have the same representation?
Not So not exactly, like even like, I mean, relationship, for example, like at this point has like 3 edges, and you can find maybe another point that also have 3 edges, but their embedding is not necessarily the same.
Well, not like just from the number of edges, but maybe in that E is related to a node which is other related again to 2 nodes. Like in the context of the full graph, E is pretty much the same as E from order 2 is the same as A from order 1, right? So it's just saying that E needs to have the same embedding as A did in the other.
Yeah, kind of. But I think the most important thing here is that the operation you're applying in terms of order, the same operation should be applied to the output of the function. So the concept of equivariance is not necessarily saying like the prediction is related to what is a property of the function, right? Where any permutation you apply to the input data structure, the same permutation will be applied to the output of the data structure. So the function will keep that permutation or the order same. So that's what equivariance means, right? So this is the example. I should have shown this slide to explain it. So we can also define it more general with the matrix, with the matrix mathematical form, where we can say that for any permutation matrix P, like any permutation that applies to the input, after we apply this function, it will be equivalent as if you apply this permutation matrix to the output. Cool. So So basically, the graph neural networks, our graph learning, always have to deal with this equivariance and invariance problem, where if we kind of learn, we want to try to learn a node level embeddings, that function needs to be permutation equivariant. And if we want to learn a graph level representation, that representation should be permutation invariant. So there are certain examples of permutation invariant equivariant function, right? For example, if you just use x as the prediction, then you can show, like, basically to derive the math that this thing is invariant. Sorry, this is not the identity. If you just take the sum of the node features, right? It doesn't matter how you order them. The sum is always invariant. And the second two examples are equivariant. Of course, and these are very important operators. So you can see a lot what's being used. Basically, if you use an identity matrix, then no matter how you permute x, its identity, so you also permute the outcome. And more interestingly, if you multiply your adjacency matrix with x, this also keeps the permutation equivariance. You can derive the math by just multiplying p in front of this a and x, and you can show that then the multiplication of that is p transpose px, and the middle term will disappear because it's a permutation matrix. So you kind of do a permutation, and then you undo the permutation, so that becomes identity, right? So this is a very important property of graph learning, because what effectively a times x is doing is basically multiplying adjacency matrix with your current node feature. Effectively, you can consider that as extracting out the features from your neighbors and sum them together, right? So this is what we sometimes call it. You can consider it as kind of like a convolution over defining the neighborhood space, where you only do a convolution over this neighbor space. Cool. So effectively, what graph neural networks is designed with. To be clear, this is just an example of equivariant function. There are a lot more equivariant function than these. Right? You can consider like transformer or attention being also somehow equivariance, right? I mean, attention without precision encoding, of course. So in this case, the graph neural networks can be considered as of a type of architectures which comprise of multiple layers, where these layers uses a combination of equivariant and invariant functions to do the extraction of the features. And at the end, you will get either equivariant node level embeddings, right, like at this layer, or you can also get an invariant prediction as a graph level prediction. So if we look at this, revisit this like classical deep learning architectures like MLPs, right? Apparently, they will fail in the neural network, in the graph learning case, because in the MLP, you explicitly define the order, and your embedding matrix has intrinsically defined order of the position. So it does not have this, apparently does not have this invariance and equivariance. And so, because the convolution neural networks rely on MLP as the last layer, it similarly does not have some of these properties. I guess so we talked about kind of position invariance previously, right? So like there is a operator called max pooling operator, where like if you have some pattern in your convolutional neural networks and that activates a neuron, and you take the maximum of that across all positions, you will always get the same result regardless of where you put that pattern in your input. That is one type of invariance as well. It's kind of called positional invariance. This is not the same as permutation invariance, right? This might got confused a little bit, but this is not the same as permutation invariance, because you're only looking at that single pattern being appearing in different positions, where kind of graph considers more like complicated patterns where things can be shuffled around in any order. All right, so then the problem of graph neural networks is how we design these architectures using some of the known operators that are equivariant and invariant. So the idea of graph convolutional neural networks are basically it try to define a new way of doing computation graph, where instead of having a fixed computation graph given the input structure, graph neural networks define a new computation graph based on the input structure itself, based on the connectivity of your input structure itself. So effectively, it is an algorithm that try to define a way of aggregating information from the neighbors, and doing that for multiple times, such that the information is aggregated and propagated through the structure of the graph, which is defined in the input. So you can see that the computation graph changes with the input, which is kind of which is not the same as convolutional neural networks and MLP. It is a little bit similar, like transformer, right? So attention. So as I said previously, attention is one family that is you can consider that as one type of permutation invariant and equivariant operator as well, if you don't use some kind of positional encoding, of course. And in the next lecture, we will see that attention can be used and deployed in the graph neural networks as well. But I think the graph convolutional neural networks are in the graph convolutional neural networks, we don't necessarily need attention because you could see that this adjacency matrix is actually quite sparse. So how we can effectively use this sparsity of connectivity, which may make the computation more efficient than a attention neural networks, where effectively everything connects. So it's kind of a fully connected graph. So take a concrete example, what I mean by aggregating neighbors and like propagating along the graph by how we determine the computation graph. So assuming that we have a target node 8 here, and the goal is to learn the embedding for A, right? We want to make use of all the information around A and try to differentiate like different patterns if A are connected to different nodes. So what this computation graph building process is basically to define a computation graph such that for each node embeddings, it can be the embeddings of the node can be updated by the information from the connectivity in this local network of neighborhoods. So specifically here, like if we want to update information about A, right, we will ask who are the neighbors of A. Then in this graph, it's B, C, and D, right, in the one hot neighbor. So effectively, it defines this operation where we, to learn information about A, we use the information from B, C, and D and aggregated them to update A's information. And similarly, for B, C, and D, we can define similar operator, right, similar way of propagating information from B's neighbor, which are A and C. So on the bottom layer, a similar operation will be applied to B nodes. And by repeating this kind of multiple times, we're kind of doing more and more layers of aggregation, such as information from further away from node A will eventually be propagated to A after several of these layers. And what the deep learning happens in this kind of operator that aggregates and processes the information from the neighbor. And the good thing about graph neural networks is it tries to reuse the same sets of parameters and same networks for all of these repeatable operations of aggregation, such that we save the space, and so such that we can have an efficient network architecture that try to like aggregate only like that make use of the sparsity of this connectivity. So again, like in the transformer, like basically we will be removing this local information by connecting all pair of nodes together, right? So each time you aggregate, you're aggregating across all the nodes, which can be very expensive. But here we use this much smaller architecture and smaller sets of parameters to effectively capture information defined by the graph. So if we unfold this computation graph at different nodes, right, you could define. You can see that for each different node, when we derive their embeddings, a different computation graph is used. So interestingly, this computation graph, although it's defined differently for different node, we can actually compute it over the entire graph with one forward pass if we parameterize and derive the computation of this aggregation process with matrix. And another concept is multi-step information propagation, which is basically stacking multiple layers of graph neural networks, right? So assuming that each time you're aggregating information from your one hot neighbors, which is in the layer 0, so after layer 0, your node B has the information of A and C, and by doing a second aggregation from B to A, you can see that now the information from C is carried over to B and then to A. So effectively, A sees information of things that are kind of a two-hop. Well, this is a bad example. I should say like node E and A, right? So E is not immediately connecting to A. However, after two-step of aggregation, the information from E is propagated to A through this multiple stack of graph neural network layers. So the more layers you stack, the node will be accessing like more layers of like k hops of information. And the as I said, like the key operation that's done is this aggregation, right? So what function were we using in this box? That's what the graph neural networks. That's the parameters of the graph neural networks. So I mean, this is so. If you look at the normal like MLP or other deep learning, what essentially can treat these information as input features, right? And basically, we want to do a multi-to-one mapping, and we want to define a neural network that can learn how to combine these features and also apply some nonlinearity and then get the final outcome. So very commonly appear way of doing that is through this formulation, right? So if you just look at the intermediate part, it looks kind of similar, right, with MLP, where you have a weight matrix and a kind of a bias matrices. So what it does here is it tries to first do the aggregation, where the aggregation is done by taking the average of the embeddings or message from your neighbors. After the average, you want to apply some like learning on top of these different dimensions. So we again apply this weight matrices on top of the aggregated features. And we're also try to include the information of the node itself. Because if you don't include that, you'll be only including information from neighbors and you lose the information of yourself. So each time we kind of update the node with its own information in the previous layer, that's what this B part is. And after we aggregate everything, we can apply, again, a nonlinearity. It can be a sigmoid, right? It can be any of the nonlinearity unit that we talked about previously. So this is essentially the very simple version of a graph neural network. One layer of graph neural network. And by stacking this repeating this for k layers, we have the final embedding, which is what we can use as kind of the node embedding. Which have the information from k-hop neighbors. Any questions about this formula here?
Is this force grading kind of thing? That you're looking at nearest neighbor, you're getting the information?
Yes.
And then you're force grading the graph.
You mean you're smoothing out the graph?
Right.
Yes, but I think it's more than smoothing because I think the filter applied here is more complex than like a normal like linear or Gaussian smoothing, because you also have this nonlinearity and exactly, you're kind of doing a convolution around the neighborhood if we consider that as smoothing. And again, this is one way of doing aggregation, which is the mean, so it's kind of like smoothing. But you can consider other type of invariant, group invariant operators. For example, max. If you're taking the max, it's not smoothing, right? It's kind of like, I don't know how to describe max, but yeah, it's a different way of aggregating information.
So you wouldn't consider this? So is this a GCN?
Yes, this is a normal GCN.
But like, so you can switch the summation to other.
Yeah, so in the next lecture, we'll have time to talk about more advanced graph neural network architectures.
Would that still be considered a GCN if you switch?
No, I think you can call it like other, like Graph Sage or GAT or other types of architectures. This is like the naive version of GCN.
And then you said that we saved on parameters, but your WK and BK are dependent on the layer. So where are we saving parameters?
We're saving parameters because we don't need the parameters for every single node. This K is defined
So
over the.
like normal convolution, image convolution, you have those receptive fields.
No, the convolution here is slightly different. So this is not the convolution over the node yet. This is the convolution over the feature dimensions. So WK has the dimension of D, which D is the feature dimension of a single node feature. The graph convolution happens like in this neighborhood aggregation, which I have not read the full form yet, because we're still dealing with HU here yet. But you can see that HU is actually a function of the feature times adjacency matrix. So there's another layer of convolution defined by the adjacency matrix.
So the earlier question I asked was basically, if you had a new node, where would you throw it in the graph? But with this formulation, then if you were to add, like, is it possible to update the graph? And if yes, does that mean you have to like basically like run K updates on all of the neighbors? Because if you're adding a new graph, then you also have to like propagate the information from the new node to the rest of the graph, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, adding a new graph, adding a new node means you're adding one more feature into both the feature vector and the adjacency matrix. Yeah. And you're exactly correct that to get the fully correct inference of that node, you need to run K layers of global convolution, global message passing. But there are research that try to do this in a more efficient way. So, yeah.
Is running K layers is basically retraining the whole system, right? Or is it not?
So training and inference is different. Training is where you try to update this weight matrices of WK and BK. I think what you're talking about is the inference. Yeah. But you are right that if you change the graph structure, the inference is non-incremental. So it can be quite expensive to update the node embedding once you change the graph. And there were some active research on how you can do this in a more incremental fashion without doing too much, repropagating the information. Great, so we can look into why this operation is invariant and equivariant, right? So assuming that you can basically unroll again the computation graph with like this graph here. So at each time, so this this layer is not it's right immediately before the aggregation here, but you can imagine that these two operations can be swapped because they are both matrix operations, right? So this is a summation here, and this is a WK, and you're sharing the weights of WK. So if you do summation of WK times X, it will be effectively the same as WK times the summation over X. So in this graph, it's right slightly different than this, where the WK is inside the summation. But I want to say that they are the same because it's linear. So as you can see that if we define this weight in this format, right, if you change the order of B, C, and D, it doesn't affect the result in the A. Because this is a summation, and it doesn't matter if the B is here or B is here. After this aggregation, you basically keep this permutation invariance. So even if you do it for multiple layers, it's effectively, because of the summation, it is permutation invariant. You always have this permutation invariance in this computation graph. So if we consider a single target node, D, right, regardless of how we label D, or how we label like all of these nodes with different letters, it's always the same computation graph, right? This can be E and this can be E, but the color of this graph remain always the same. So regardless of how you change things, the node embedding of this blue dot remains the same. And therefore, if you consider the embedding for each single node, right, it is equivariant because the embedding of each of the color of the node is the same, and when you also like do the output, when you also compute it for each single positions in the graph, you can always see that in the output of the embedding matrices, you can also make the output to be equivariant by making sure that the embeddings of the same node is located in the same position in the output embeddings of the entire within the entire matrices of node embeddings. How to say this easily is like so. Basically, the operation that we're doing, applying to each colored node, is the same, and it does not change the ordering within the colored node. So in the output, you can easily manage your computer to keep the ordering the same. And we can show exactly that by looking at the matrix representation as well. Sorry, I think there is some issue with the slides. Okay. So then so for this this permutation equivariance, there are several reasoning why this can be equivariant. It's a bit lengthy here, but I'm gonna just read it out because first of all, we can write the matrix operation such that the input node features and the output embeddings are always aligned. We don't mess up with their dimension. And we also know that for each node, if you change the order in here, the embedding of the node will remain the same, right? So effectively, you don't change the output of that single embedding. You just change the order of that embedding. Therefore, this is kind of exactly what equivariant means. Like the value doesn't change, it's just the order is changed. And how the order is changed is the same way as what you do permutate as if you're permuting the input features. So effectively, this means that this is equivariant operation if you consider the graph level, like if you consider all the nodes in the graph, and this operation of computing node embedding for every node in the graph as like the function f, then this f function is permutation equivariant. Okay, so now that we have these neural networks defined over the embeddings, and we know how to kind of propagate the information through these different layers of GNN, we can define a training loss on this graph, right? So first of all, we know that there are several trainable weights. In this case, it's just BK and WK, and we can define some training loss on top of this final node embedding, and there are if you look at this implementation, because we want to do it over all the nodes simultaneously, right? If there are V nodes, then you're doing kind of V different computation graph with this computation. If we just treat them separately, it will be quite expensive. But however, like if we look at this operation from a matrix multiplication perspective, everything can be done with just a simple matrix operation. So assuming this is the embedding map of all the node embeddings, right? And then the ith node in all of the node, the embedding has basically it's like one row of this big hidden embedding matrix of all the nodes, and this matrix is permutation equivariant at each layer. So each time we do matrix multiplication, right, it doesn't change the output, the position on the like this dimension, right? It's always this remains here if you multiply it with another matrix. So we can consider this convolution. We can consider like this aggregation from the neighborhood as a matrix multiplication operator. Effectively, what is done by is by multiplying the adjacency matrix with the feature embedding matrix. Because in the adjacency matrix, if you are a neighbor to V, you will have a value of 1, and if it's not a neighbor of V, you have a value of 0. So by multiplying, doing matrix multiplication between this matrix and the adjacency matrix and the feature vector, you effectively taking out just the features from your neighbor, because those have a weight of 1, and sum them together, because that's what the matrix multiplication operation does. And then another matrix is the number of neighbors, right? So effectively, another matrix you need for this multiplication is a node degree matrix, which is a diagonal matrix, and it has 0 everywhere. Exactly on the diagonal, you have the number of neighbors in the diagonal. And you can easily see that this mean operation, where you need to divide the matrix by number of degrees, can be taken as the inverse of this diagonal matrix of D. So effectively, what this average operator here, although it looks kind of flexible for each different node because you have different number of neighbor at different nodes, but you can actually write it down as a simple matrix multiplication between all the features and the adjacency matrix and the number of degrees. So effectively, you can compute everything still together with a very cheap GPU by doing this like matrix multiplication. And because the fact that A is sparse, we can think of a way of making this operation even faster or more efficient by taking the good properties of A, which is like a sparse matrix. So we don't waste our time by doing this expensive like 0 times something multiplication. Effectively, what it does kind of, you could try to align the number of neighbors, for example. Like for each node, I can say I only look at my k neighbor, where k is a fixed number. It could be like 10 nearest neighbor or 24 nearest neighbors, such that each time we only need to do this convolution with the smaller like subset, like 10 different embeddings. And this can be, then the matrix can be like break down into smaller chunk, and you can do matrix multiplication on these smaller chunks. So there are a lot of ways to make it effective, but what I'm trying to show here is it's not as complex as we thought, and by using these two matrices, we can do it very efficiently. And you can also see that the convolution here can be also mean by, this kind of matrix operation defined by the adjacency matrix, where effectively by doing this multiplication, you're convolving around the neighborhood of the node. Instead of in the convolutional neural networks, you're convolving around a fixed neighborhood decided by the graph, decided by the grid. All right, so this is just kind of another rewriting of the same formula by replacing the average with this, matrix multiplication, so that you can see that this is what the usual computation graph look like inside the graph neural networks, and we want to train these again the matrices of WK and BK, and the entire like efficient training research will be like how we make use of this sparse information of A. So let's talk about training. Like as I mentioned before, we have different type of prediction here, but because we have the embedding now, it's very easy to rewrite the loss function for each single task here as a function of the node embedding. For example, if we want to do node level prediction, it just kind of, you can just attach a prediction head behind after each node prediction, right? It's kind of like a simple MLP, a simple neural network prediction problem. If we're doing edge level prediction, you can consider pair of embeddings and doing, again, very simple prediction on top of pair of embeddings, because each pair of embeddings has a fixed dimension, so it's, again, a fixed dimension neural network problem. There are multiple ways. The simple way, not the simple way, the more like flexible way is to concate them together and use a linear, again, a linear or MLP to make the predictions, where the Y can be either a binary prediction, whether there's a link or not. It can also be a scalar prediction if you try to do some sort of prediction on the feature of the edge, like distance. Another very simple treatment is to just do dot product, assuming kind of these embedding gives you similarity on topology. So another training objective can be, if you want to enforce kind of some kind of dot product as a metric of similarity, then you can use this to predict the link. and parameterize your loss with respect to